Hello to everyone this morning, and welcome to the second and final webinar for our Entrepreneurship in Emerging Markets 2026 Global Case Writing Competition. Today's webinar will review the purpose, structure, and insights about writing a good teaching note, which must accompany the case you submit into our competition. The competition, as most of you know, is sponsored by the William Davidson Institute at the University of Michigan, also by WDI Publishing, and by the Zell-Lurie Institute for Entrepreneurship here at the University of Michigan. My name is Sandy Draheim, and I'm the manager of WDI Publishing, which is part of WDI. For those not familiar with the William Davidson Institute, we are a global nonprofit that works with emerging markets, particularly at the intersection of education, entrepreneurship, and impact. WDI uses the power of business and markets to drive inclusive economic growth, and our current sector focuses are clean energy, e-mobility, climate health, and health. I will be your presenter today, but before we begin, a bit of housekeeping. If you have a question during this presentation, please send it within the Q&A function in Zoom. The Q&A button should be located next to screen share on your screen. I will answer as many questions as possible during the Q&A period at the end of the presentation, but I will also aim to keep this webinar to less than 1 hour. You probably noticed when you logged in today that the webinar is being recorded. The recording will be made available on the competition website, as well as a link to the recording will be emailed to everyone that registered for this webinar. This is our agenda for today. First, I'll share a brief overview of the competition and then a brief recap of the sections of a case, which I presented at the last webinar. Then the primary presentation today will be about writing an effective teaching note, and hopefully reveal methods for you to write a more compelling one to accompany your case submission. And then lastly, a brief Q&A session. Let's briefly review the key details of our competition. First, the topic. The topic has to be about entrepreneurship in an emerging market. Some topics and themes you might want to think about could be financing and investment challenges, could also be social and inclusive entrepreneurship, maybe technology and innovation challenges, or even institutional and regulatory challenges, sustainability, climate entrepreneurship, even education and skills and ecosystem development. All of these things could be potential topics or themes for your case submission to the competition. Regarding who can enter, university faculty can enter either individually or in teams. Graduate or undergraduate students can also enter either individually or in teams, as long as they enter in collaboration with a faculty member. And then finally, practitioners may also enter, but they must also enter in collaboration with a faculty member. The reason we require this collaboration with a faculty member is to ensure that the submitted documents have academic rigor and strong pedagogy. And then finally, the prize awards are $5,000. These are US dollars, $5,000 for first place. Second place, $3,000, and third place will be $1,000. We may also award some honorable mentions, and they will not get cash prizes, but they will also be edited and published by WDI Publishing, as well as the first 1 through 3 place winners. They will also be published by WDI Publishing. Just a brief overview of some of the judging criteria. Topic and content will be part of the criteria. Of course, it needs to be about entrepreneurship in emerging markets. We'll also have a criteria of judging on teaching and learning value, the whole introduction and overview part of the case. We'll evaluate the protagonist and the organization you're featuring in your case. We'll look at the dilemma, and then we'll look at overall writing and citations and endnotes included in your case. And then we'll also evaluate your teaching note as part of the judging criteria. I've listed the finalist judges here. They are Rose A. Dodd, and she's the executive director at the Education Collaborative at Ashishi University in Ghana. We also have Grace Shah Haburl, who is CEO and co-founder of Warmaloo. Gautam Kaul is professor of finance at the University of Michigan. Ruth M. Kiraka is associate professor of management at Strathmore University in Kenya. John Lofkus is a senior editor at Harvard Business Publishing. Chukwuemeka Okeke is senior programs coordinator, LEAP Africa in Nigeria. And Dr. Anika Okekiaru is director of the Enterprise Development Center at Pan Atlantic University in Nigeria. These are a few of the submission requirements. Topic, of course, again, must be about entrepreneurship in an emerging market. A teaching note must be included, and we'll talk a lot more about teaching notes in a few seconds here. There must be a protagonist and a decision point or dilemma included in your case. Your case must be previously unpublished. That's very important. We don't run into any copyright situations. If your case is chosen as winner and we go to publish it, we want to make sure that we're not infringing on any other copyright. And then it must include citations and endnote sources for any data in your case. And also on this slide, you'll see the key dates. In about a week or so, January 30th, we'd love it if you could submit your intent to enter form. This is not the deadline for your final submission. It's just your indication that you intend to enter. April 13th, however, is the deadline for you to submit your documents. And you can learn more details about how to do that on our website. And then in September of 2026, we will announce the winners publicly of the competition. Again, I'm going to very briefly review what we reviewed at our last webinar, the case study structure, which you see on this slide. First is the title, should feature the name of the organization and allude to the dilemma in the case. Please don't make it too long. About 10 to 12 words would be good. The introduction to the case must identify the protagonist, the organization, introduce the dilemma, clarify the time frame for the case. The introduction also needs to include the tension or urgency surrounding the case dilemma. And then the background information in the case should present all relevant facts and data. Examples of things that go in the background information are industry information, information about the featured organization or company, maybe number of employees, locations, products, services, financials, history of the company, etc. And then the conclusion of the case should restate the dilemma and the time frame and the urgency, and should also indicate what questions the protagonist has to answer in order to solve the dilemma of the case. And then the other parts on this slide are exhibits, tables, and figures, appendices in your case. These are primarily visuals you might want to use to accompany your case study. Just remember that each graphic must be referenced in the text, regardless of where the graphic is positioned in the case. And also beneath each graphic needs to be a source line for where that data came from. If you created the graphic yourself, you can just put created by the case authors. But if you created the graphic yourself, but used data from another source, we need to indicate that source. Citations are consecutive superscript numbers that appear, excuse me, within your text, and they usually at the end of the text that you're referencing. Endnotes fall at the end of the case. They have the same number as the in-text citation, and they're a full source line for the data that you reference. Footnotes fall at the bottom of the page of the word or phrase they reference. Endnotes provide full source information to support text, but footnotes generally provide a brief explanation of a term or a concept mentioned in the case. So I encourage you to review the WDI Publishing document, How to Write a Business Case, for more details, and that document can be accessed on our website. I'd like to get into the section of the presentation now about how to write a teaching note and tips on writing a teaching note. But first, let's talk about why we need a teaching note at all, because I think this is important to understand before you try to write one. A teaching note is really the foundation upon which a successful case study is built. The purpose of the teaching note is to provide instructors with a how-to guide for facilitation of the case study. A good teaching note will give professors a roadmap for class discussion and serve as a starting point for instructors who would like to adopt the material into their classroom. While some people recommend that the teaching note be written after the case study, I think it's best to write the teaching note in parallel with the case. It should be treated as a work in progress and developed simultaneously with the case, in other words. While the structure of the teaching note may vary from one case study to the next, based on content and methodology, a well-structured teaching note is generally about 6 to 8 pages in length. Case studies, as you know, are effective ways to focus students on relevant information and use that information to make a decision. But to help enable this focus for instructors who use the case, there needs to be a teaching note that answers 2 questions, and they're listed here on the slide. The first question is, what is the student supposed to do? And the other is, how is the instructor supposed to use the case in helping the student do it? Without the key teaching note, the case is merely a story. With no teaching note, the instructor is left to determine if, how, and where to apply that story to their classroom. Instructors can experience a higher success rate in achieving learning outcomes and save significant time by using a thoughtfully written teaching note in conjunction with a case study. On the screen right now is the teaching note structure, and I will break these down for you. I'll read them quickly. The first part is the case overview. That's the first section in a teaching note. The second are learning objectives. Third, pedagogy. Next, assignment questions. Then a case analysis, a teaching plan, and then it winds up with a conclusion. So let's break down each section of a teaching note. The first section is the case overview, and really this is an executive summary of the case that should include, again, the time frame, information about the organization, should introduce the protagonist, and most importantly, state the dilemma to be solved in the case, along with the dilemma's tension and urgency. The case overview is a 1 or 2 paragraph executive summary, as I said, of the case. It's often what professors read first when they're trying to decide whether this case will fit into their course and have applicability and relevance. So therefore, the case overview, should capture the essence of the case and the primary business challenge. When writing your case overview, it's important to be very clear and concise. Again, it should only be a couple of paragraphs, probably no more than 3. The next section of a teaching note are the learning objectives, and these are quite important as well. Learning objectives should state what students should be able to do and apply after analyzing and discussing the case. In fact, WDI cases encourage authors to begin each learning objective with the phrase, after reading and discussing the case, students should be able to, and then you complete each learning objective after that first part of the sentence. WDI cases typically include 2 to 5 total learning objectives, and they are generally presented in bullet point format or numbered format. The learning objectives section of the teaching note is important since it helps the instructor determine if the objectives of the case fit the goals and objectives of their course. And the next few slides will hopefully make it easier for you to create effective learning objectives for students who will be analyzing your case. As you develop your learning objectives, try to remember the following. A learning objective contains a verb, which is an action, and an object, which is usually a noun. You'll see that on the slide here. The verb generally refers to actions associated with the intended cognitive process. And the object generally describes the knowledge that students are expected to acquire or construct. And also remember that these are objectives, not activities. Objectives are intended outcomes, and activities are what students may need to complete to achieve the learning objectives. The primary reason that we have learning objectives constructed as described is because in the 1950s, there was an American educational psychologist named Benjamin Bloom, and he developed a taxonomy of educational objectives that fostered a common vocabulary for thinking about learning goals. Bloom's cognitive process dimension represents a continuum of increasing cognitive complexity from lower order thinking skills to higher order thinking skills, as shown on this slide. Actually, this slide shows a revised version of his original taxonomy. In the learning process, the levels must progress in order. In other words, the student cannot achieve the higher levels without first achieving the first level. So reading this slide from left to right shows the most basic level of knowledge at the left, with each successive column indicating increasing levels of knowledge as you move to the right. Under each cognitive process, there are examples of appropriate verbs that might be included in a learning objective that supports that particular cognitive dimension. A brief breakdown of the cognitive categories includes column 1 or level 1, which is remembering. And while this is a most basic level and can be tested through memorization, it does not mean the student totally understands what they have learned. Column 2 or level 2 represents understanding, which usually means a student can explain course concepts in their own words by paraphrasing. Column number 3 or level 3 is applying. This means students can take what they have learned in the classroom and apply it to a scenario outside the classroom. For example, if the course teaches pricing strategies, a student could see if they can determine what strategy is used by an online store they order from regularly. That would be an example. Column 4 or level 4 is analyzing. Achieving this level in Bloom's taxonomy means that students can implement critical thinking skills to analyze how or why different concepts work together. Column 5 or level 5 is evaluating. This level asks students to make value judgments about the material they have studied. And then column 6 or level 6 is creating. In this final level, students are encouraged to not only apply what they have learned, but also build something tangible or conceptual. On this slide, I list a few actual learning objectives that appear in various WDI teaching notes. These examples are not related to each other. They each come from a different teaching note, but I thought it might be helpful for you to actually see some samples of actual learning objectives that have been published in teaching notes for various cases. I will let you read these on your own, and they'll also be on the recording. The next section of a teaching note is pedagogy. This will fall after learning objectives. And this section of your teaching note should detail or identify the audience for the case, business disciplines for which the case would be appropriate, any prerequisite materials for courses, and sometimes a list of supplemental reading materials that can accompany a case. So this slide is a list of what types of information should be positioned in this section. The audience of the case states to whom the case is relevant. So in other words, is it appropriate for undergraduate students, MBA students, other graduate students, executive education students, all of the above? Is it appropriate more for one student audience than another? Is it adaptable to all students? If so, how should the instructor adapt it? All of those questions should be answered in this particular section. In terms of business disciplines, for which business disciplines is the case appropriate? Is it appropriate to marketing, operations management, strategy, leadership? If the case can be adapted to courses in multiple business disciplines, then you should indicate all of them. And sometimes when discussing business disciplines, the teaching note states whether or not a case has already been tested in a course and the results of that testing. That's very valuable information for a potential instructor of the case. In the pedagogy section, you should also list any prerequisite courses or knowledge that students should have before studying this particular case. For example, Are there business concepts students should be familiar with, such as Michael Porter's 5 Forces, for example? Or should they be familiar with how to develop a business plan? Should they have specific data analysis skills before studying the case? Once again, all these questions should be answered in the pedagogy section. Finally, if there are supplemental materials that can be used by students and instructors to expand their understanding of the case, please list them in this section. Supplemental materials can include things like videos, articles, books, websites, other reference materials, things of that nature. Supplemental materials should be categorized by medium, for example, website resources, written resources, magazine resources, online resources, just to kind of categorize them for the instructor. Supplemental material should also include the same access information that you include in an EndNote source. So in other words, include an online link to the supplemental material if possible. The next section of a teaching note are the assignment questions. Sometimes assignment questions is interchangeable with discussion questions, but in WDI teaching notes, they're generally assignment questions. The assignment questions should focus on focusing student analysis. This is very important because cases include a lot of information, and assignment questions can kind of focus students in on the right information that they're reviewing. Additionally, the assignment questions should support learning objectives. The assignment questions should also incite students to critical thinking. And if you add a little controversy to the questions that you develop to be assignment questions, that can make for a more lively discussion. Remember that assignment questions guide the instructor in achieving the desired learning outcomes for the case. So when I said that they need to support the learning objectives, that's true, because if the assignment questions are well crafted, they will challenge students to reach a defendable conclusion based on theories, concepts, or formulas relevant to the case and even to the overall goals of the course. To determine if your assignment questions are rigorous and appropriate, ask yourself these questions once you've written them. Can the question be answered by someone who has not read the case? If so, then there's really no reason for the case. Can the question be answered by a student who has read the case, but without using any of the frameworks or concepts presented in the case? If not, then the question should be rewritten. Try to ensure that each question requires that level of critical thought and critical thinking, and try not to include questions that have a yes or no answer. But if you must do so, if the question does have a yes or no answer, make sure you add the question why right after the question. Open-ended questions generally make better assignment questions. And then, as I said, incorporating controversy and controversial questions creates a much more lively and interesting class discussion, but one that you might have to keep under better control from an instructor's standpoint. As with learning objectives, I've listed some examples of assignment questions here. And each of these assignment questions comes from a different teaching note, just so you know, they're not related to each other. The first one, in what ways can leaders communicate and influence positive change in their organizations? The second one is, what characteristic of Vietnam's cultural, political, and economic environment contribute to the unique challenges and opportunities of starting a venture in that country? That is truly an entrepreneurship related assignment question. How is Hampton Creek's entrance into the mayonnaise market a disruption within the existing industry? What is the difference between primary and secondary markets? What is the value proposition of the stock exchange business model? And then the last is, what is the difference between primary and secondary markets? What's the value proposition? I'm sorry, that last question is repeated. That's okay. My apologies. The next section of a teaching note is the case analysis section. The case analysis section provides a more detailed insight into the case, as well as comprehensive answers to the assignment questions. Answering the set of discussion or assignment questions should require the students to apply appropriate theoretical and conceptual frameworks presented in the case. The case analysis is really the heart of the teaching note. It provides a roadmap on how to lead a case discussion. It also provides careful analysis and detailed insights into the case and its associated readings. Again, the analysis should offer comprehensive answers to the list of assignment questions. These answers should offer samples of good, bad, and marginal answers, as well as reflect the diversity of opinions that are nearly always present within a classroom. Keep in mind, the instructor wants to know what to expect if they adopt this case, so the assignment questions and their answers should be as comprehensive and diverse as possible. If the case contains comprehensive data or quantitative data, then the analysis section should suggest ways to use that data and techniques to be used for analyzing the data. If students should use unique frameworks for analyzing the case, these should also be reviewed in detail in this section. Providing answers to the assignment questions is often one of the most important aspects of a teaching note when an instructor is considering whether or not to adopt a case. The discussion questions responses serve as a crucial pedagogical tool in guiding the instructor toward best achieving the learning objectives. The next section of the teaching note is generally the teaching plan. The teaching plan indicates how the instructor should allocate time in class for discussing different parts of the case. For most business school courses, this is a 75 to 80-minute session. So sometimes the teaching plan is visually set up as a timetable or in-class schedule within the teaching note. The typical components of a teaching plan are listed here on the slide and would include the class introduction. And this generally includes a review of the primary key points presented in the case. Next, the assignment questions should be listed in the order they should be discussed and how much time to spend on discussing each of them. Often in this section, the author includes suggestions for more student interaction, such as breaking the class into groups, then having each group present their answer, and then rationale for one or more of the assignment questions. In other words, breakout groups in class. This particular strategy uh, encourages collaboration and a more open exchange of ideas. Time and topic allocation should then be assigned to wrap-up points or the conclusion of the in-class discussion. Key points of the case should be recapped, as well as tied back to the learning objectives for the case. Including a board plan is often extremely helpful for an instructor in teaching your case. So a board plan is quite literally the information an instructor should list on a blackboard or whiteboard or other viewable in-class medium during the case discussion. And there are many possible ways to set up a board plan, from capturing just main discussion points to filling multiple boards with all in-class ideas, for example. Instructors could use board headings to reinforce and support the structure and flow of the case discussion, and some instructors fill out the boards before class with key contextual facts, rows and column headings for quantitative analysis, or even an agenda. So there's many ways to approach the board plan that you could discuss in the teaching note. And then finally is the conclusion of the teaching note. The conclusion should provide additional clarity about the case, key takeaways that students should reflect upon after discussing the case. Students should be able to provide at least high-level answers to two fundamental questions after a case discussion. Those questions are, what did I learn today? You'll see this on the slide. And for many case instructors, what did I learn and why does it matter are the two questions that students should be able to answer after a case discussion. But for case instructors, the closing or this conclusion is less about recapping the class discussion and more about an opportunity to highlight conceptual or managerial themes. It can also be more about providing a bridge to past or future classes and offer personal reflections and even inspire and motivate their students. So the conclusion of the teaching note is different from the conclusion in a case. As we're talking about conclusions, this is the place where if you're talking about a real, not a fictional organization or company, an epilogue might be included here for the instructor's eyes only, and then he will decide whether he wants to share it and when he wants to share it with the class. If an epilogue is included, it should explain what the company or protagonist actually did. And then the instructor should provide students with this information, generally at the conclusion of the case discussion, but really that's up to the instructor. Epilogues can be particularly valuable to students because it shares the actual decisions that were made and provides how the actual decision maker responded to the case's situations and the outcomes that resulted. I see some questions coming in, and I'm going to get to those in 1 second. Once I talk about a few common challenges in writing a teaching note, just kind of be on the lookout for these as you construct your teaching note. First challenge are learning objectives. Sometimes there's not enough specificity in the learning objectives. For example, apply a model, but if you're going to say apply a model, apply it to what? Or use a framework, but use a framework to do what. Just make sure that learning objectives are very specific. Another challenge is sometimes it's too difficult to measure the learning objective. In other words, the objectives can be too vague to be able to measure. That's the reason for applying more specificity to learning objectives and to follow Bloom's taxonomy that I discussed earlier. Another common challenge in teaching notes are the assignment questions. Some teaching notes you will read do not give specific answers to the assignment questions. At WDI, at least, we think this is a mistake and that there should be answers provided in the teaching note to each assignment question. You'll remember that goes in the case analysis section. Another challenge is that if answers are provided to the assignment questions, they're not supported by the case information, or they're straightforward copy-paste from the case. So if the student can copy and paste answers from the case, then the assignment questions are a little too easy. However, if the information needed to answer the assignment question is not included in the case, well, then it's impossible for the student to answer the question. So just be cautious as you compose your assignment questions that you don't run into any of these kind of common challenges. We're almost to the question and answer period, but this slide again lists resources for not only the case competition, but resources for writing a case and teaching note. So I really encourage you all to really explore our website for the competition if you haven't yet, because it's very important. Okay, so we're now at a point where I'm happy to take some questions, and I see some have come in on our Q&A, so let me look at these briefly. I have a very specific question first. I'll read it to you. Would it be acceptable to write a case study on a U.S. woman entrepreneur and the challenges with entering and doing business in an emerging market? Yes, that would be perfectly appropriate as long as you've included that emerging market element and that the dilemma is focused on that emerging market. So yes, that would be appropriate. Someone has asked if I could go back to the earlier slide in the presentation that gives the overview of the key components of the teaching note. Sure, I will go back to that right now in case people need some more time to look at that overview. These are the main elements in a teaching note, and you'll remember I broke down each of these in the subsequent slides. Someone else is asking if this presentation will be shared. It will be shared in a recording of the webinar today, and that recording of this webinar will be made available to you within a couple of days. It might be early next week, but if you registered for this webinar, you will receive a link to a recording of the webinar. Okay. As we're waiting for more questions to come in, I just want to make clear that the case study you're writing and the teaching note you're writing, while they go together and have to be submitted together, the audiences for each of these documents is completely different. So the case study is being written for a student in a course. The case study is written as a teaching tool that the student uses to develop their critical thinking and to come up with maybe multiple solutions to a dilemma. On the other hand, the audience for the teaching note is the instructor or the faculty member. sometimes it's helpful to keep those two things in mind as you write each document because you're writing to two different audiences. So just keep that in mind. I would also remind everyone of the deadlines I covered earlier. January 30th is next week, and that is when we'd like to receive everyone's intent to enter form. This is not the deadline for your final submission. It is just a form to fill out on our competition website and then submit so that we have a good idea of how many people are going to be submitting final documents this year. It also gives us a chance to look at the form you submitted to see if we could point out any potential challenges in the information we've asked you to provide. Final deadline for submitting documents is April 13th. That can be done online right on our website. Your submission document should be uploaded along with the submission form that you'll find on our website. Very easy to find. Also, a reminder again, the resources on our website, competition website, has some very rich information. I encourage you to review it as it may help. I'm looking at some more questions that have come in. I have a very good question. Let me read it to you, and then I'll do my best to answer. Is it better to focus a case on a single framework, topic, or subject, or make it broader so that it can be used across multiple topics and subjects? Also asking here, what is the best length for a case, and then the best length for a teaching note? I'm going to answer the last part of that question first. The average length for a WDI case is between, probably 10 and 15 pages. The average length of a teaching note is probably between 8 and 10 pages. Again, these are averages. It can be less than that. They can be more than that. I'm just giving you an average. There's not a requirement that any of these documents be any specific length. As far as the other question is concerned, should you focus on a single framework or topic or make it broader? We have cases that have done both. It's really up to you and your capacity for constructing your case and teaching note. If you can write a case in a broader sense and make it applicable to more business disciplines and types of courses, that will increase your adoption. But having said that, if you focus on a single topic or framework, that can also be adopted widely in that particular subject area. So my answer here is it can go either way. It's really up to you. You can have success doing it either way. Here's another question. Can a case be developed using secondary sources alone with valid citations? The answer to that is yes. You can use secondary sources all the way throughout your case. You can talk about your featured organization and cite publicly available sources for the data you're discussing in your case. That's absolutely fine. Yes, as long as you cite where your information is coming from with complete sources. Okay, we are coming up to the end of our webinar, and I certainly appreciate everybody that attended today. Again, there will be a recording available. I will send that to everyone within a few days, but a link to it will also be available on our website probably sometime next week. And I do hope everyone enters our competition. And if you have any questions that I haven't answered, please feel free to email info@wdipublishing.com, and I'll be happy to answer you by email. So this concludes today's webinar. And if I did not answer your question today, I will try to email it to you after we conclude today. Again, good luck with everything, and thank you for your attention today. I really appreciate it.